Okay, so in this video, we're going to turn our attention to internal economies of scale. Previous topic, we looked at external economies of scale, but this one is very much looking at internal economies. So what do we mean by this? So one of the first things to note before we get into looking at the model, if you like, of internal economies of scale, the models that we've looked at so far, Cardian HO model, really shows that trade should be greater in countries that are more different. Yeah. So, in other words, where the more a country, I should say, has a comparative advantage, the more they should trade with another country. But that's actually not necessarily what we see in the data and what we've experienced in history. A lot of world trade is actually between similar countries who produce similar goods. We call this um, intra-industry trade. Yeah, not intra-firm, intra-industry. So it's basically when goods are traded that are very similar. And the estimate is that about 25 to 50% of world trade is actually intra-industry. So this kind of goes against these models, and so we want to investigate why this might be the case. For example, trade in manufactured goods is, or has historically anyway, been amongst, or the majority of it has been amongst advanced industrial countries. In other words, one developed country exporting its its manufactured goods to another developed country who also exports manufactured goods to the other country. And so we need to be able to explain this. You can see here that this is just for the US, of course, but the European data is actually very similar, where the amount of intra-industry trade is an index. You can see that for some, it's nearly 1. It's nearly complete. In other words, all of the trade that occurs is intra-industry trade. And then going all the way down to the other end, this is where you start to see the differences in comparative advantage, things like footwear, clothing, and apparel. So as I said, this is hard to explain using comparative advantage. But one element to this, and this has been one of the main advances, if you like, in trade theory over the last 20 or so years, is to look at this idea that, or this recognition almost, that products are differentiated. Okay, this is the idea of essentially monopolistic competition, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. So whilst they are seemingly trading in the same goods, Germany exports a car to the US exports a car to Germany, they're not identical. Yeah? The products that they are making, that Germany makes from BMW and Mercedes, etc., they are differentiated from a Ford or a Holden, that sort of thing. The next question then is about the firms themselves. And so one of the things that we're going to address is this issue of, well, okay, so you've got firms in an industry. Are the firms the same? Are they all equally as productive? Yeah. And the answer, of course, is no, not really. And this, from one of the co-authors of the books, of the textbook that we use, and this guy has been very heavily involved in research looking into this issue. He says, this is back in 2003, recent empirical research using longitudinal plant or firm level data, in other words, not just looking at country A exporting to country B, but looking at the actual firms themselves that are exporting to other countries. It's overwhelmingly substantiated the existence of large and persistent productivity differences amongst establishments in the same industries. In other words, in economic speak, we say that firms are heterogeneous. In other words, they're different. They've got different levels of productivity. Some are better than others in terms of their use of resources. And so we need to take that into consideration when we're thinking about trade. Another issue, just before we get into the model of this, firms also produce different varieties. And so this is essentially what I was talking about before. you know, lots of car makers produce their own SUV. Even within these subcategories, not just, you know, cars or passenger vehicles, even within a more detailed classification like SUVs, they're similar but differentiated. Germany will import from the USA and export to the USA, vice versa. Similarly, the UK and Germany, and so on and so forth. So this is what gives us this intra-industry trade. So a good model at the micro level, anyway, to examine this, of course, is monopolistic competition. Before we do that, it's probably worthwhile going back. Remember, with monopolistic competition, the type of market structure that this is has similarities to monopolies and has elements of competition as well, hence the name, right? So we're going to go back and have a quick recap in terms of monopolies, but remember that that monopoly model extends then to monopolistic competition. We can use that in monopolistic competition, but then of course introduce competition to the model to make it reflect this monopolistically competitive market structure. Okay, so won't spend a great deal of time on this because a lot of this is just recapping from work that you would have done in a previous course or unit. Remember, in monopoly, and again, we're not talking about monopolistic competition just yet. In monopoly, the firm faces the entire market. Given the demand, if the firm wants to sell another unit of output, it needs to lower its price for everyone. And if it lowers its price, this then creates that wedge between the price that they sell it at and the extra revenue or the marginal revenue that they get. So remember, the marginal revenue is the net change from the gain in revenue from selling one more unit, but then you've got to subtract off the revenue from selling it at a lower price. Our expression, if you like, for marginal revenue is here. You can see that it's formally derived in the appendix, but the appendix uses a bit of calculus and stuff, and I don't expect you to be able to, or I don't need you to be able to prove or to show marginal revenue is, or how we calculate it. You simply just need to remember this. So the marginal revenue here is just the price minus the quantity being sold over B, and this B is just a constant, and it's no big deal, but what we're going to see is that this is sort of representative. Here's my rubbish writing. This is basically the slope parameter. All right. So the slope of this, or the slope of the demand curve, will therefore determine or influence, if you like, the degree to which the marginal revenue lies below the price. So the larger this is, the larger this B is, that just simply means this whole number here, there, the larger this is getting, then the smaller this is getting overall. And so in other words, the marginal revenue and the price are quite close together. Yeah, the smaller this is, the further they are apart. That's basically all you've got to remember there. Visually, of course, we want to look at this in terms of we want to incorporate the costs as well. A little bit different from some of the cost curves you might have seen previously. It's not a major issue here in the sense that it's enough for us to assume constant marginal costs. You can see it's horizontal, and so all that is saying is that, you know, the extra cost of producing one more unit of output is simply equal to the extra cost of the previous unit. Yeah, so that's fine. You can see the average costs are declining over the range, and again that just represents the fact that as output increases, you're spreading fixed costs over greater and greater output, so it's always downward sloping. In terms of profit, we've got our sort of main micro profit maximizing result, which is where firms will produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. The profit here, therefore, is simply, so you get marginal revenue equal to marginal cost there. What's the price? Read that off the demand curve, and then look to see where average cost is. And so the amount of profit is obviously this shaded area here. And that's our basic kind of monopoly model. Now, extending this to monopolistic competition. Obviously, it's similar. Remember, we sort of treat each firm as its own little sub-market, and so, you know, that's what gives rise to the revenue curves for monopolistic competition, looking very similar to that in a monopoly. But of course, what we have to introduce here is the fact that, well, there are firms that are producing a similar, not identical, but a similar good. And so we need to incorporate the demand for other firms as well, or the demand for other firms' goods into this too. As more varieties come into the market, in other words, as we get more firms producing, these slightly differentiated products, demand for the existing products is going to decrease. And as you may remember from this model, also in the long run, essentially economic profit is zero. The competition, the number of firms in this market will guarantee that these profits here, these positive economic profits, dissipate to zero. If profits are being made, additional firms will enter, or producing a slightly differentiated product that will take some of the demand away from the existing firms until the price is equal to average cost and economic profit is zero. Okay, so that's a quick recap on that. So given all that, we want to work out the following issues. We want to work out how many firms they're going to be in equilibrium, what the prices are, what the quantity, what the costs, and therefore what the overall industry quantity is. Now, initially, anyway, we're going to assume no international trade. Obviously, we're going to relax that subsequently, but we want to have a look first of all of how we derive, if you like, equilibrium just within a particular country. So we're going to look at the relationship between the number of firms and average costs, and the second is the relationship between the number of firms and prices being charged. So a firm in monopolistic competition is expected to sell more the larger the industry demand. Simply, the market is bigger, okay? And they will also sell more if their rivals charge higher prices. Yeah, so it's positively or output for a particular firm, an individual firm, is positively related to industry demand and higher prices charged by rivals, and is negatively related to the number of competing firms. So the size, but the number of competitors, and the higher is its own price. Yeah? So we can represent that by this function here. Again, we don't need to derive it, or you don't need to learn the derivation of it. You just simply need to learn the basics of what it represents. So obviously here, this big Q is an individual firm sale, so we're looking at it from the firm's perspective. The S there is the total sales in the industry, so we're looking at this as this Q being, if you like, almost a fraction or a percentage of the overall market size. N is the number of firms in the industry. B is this constant. It represents the responsiveness, so it's very similar to the slope parameter that we sort of looked at before. And then we've got this term here, which is simply just the difference between the price this firm charges relative to the average price charged by its competitors. So what about costs? Well, again, if we make a couple of assumptions here, if we say that all firms charge the same price, they have equal market share here. If I go back, so output is equal to the number of is equal to overall sales divided by the number of firms, right? So they're all producing an average quantity. We can get that simply by, if the prices are the same, this becomes zero, right? So this whole bit here becomes zero. So Q is just S over N, right? So that's just saying, okay, well, let's assume all firms are the same. They're all producing the same price, selling at the same price, and therefore we're kind of talking about an average here. So average costs depend, number one, on the size of the market, and that's this term here, remember, and two, the number of firms. That's this one here. So costs increase with the number of firms, so this is on the numerator. So if this is high, then average costs are high, and decrease with the size of the market, as we said before. Okay, so as that gets larger, average costs fall. And why is that? Well, just very simply, if you've got a large number of firms, that by definition means that you're having a smaller market share. Yeah, if you've got 10 firms, you might have a 10% market share. But if there's 20 firms, you're only going to have 5% market share. There's economies of scale issue here in the sense that the costs can't get low enough because you don't get that size. So that's why costs increase with the number of firms. But of course, it decreases with the size of the market because for the same but opposite reason, in the sense that if you've got a really large market, then chances are your output is quite large as well. And so you're able to achieve some of these economies of scale. So you're further, if you like, further down along your average cost curve. Okay, so we're going to try and sort of bring all that together here. And you can see this is, got to be a bit careful here. This is a slightly different model. We've got obviously dollars and cents on the vertical axis here. We've got price or cost. But on this horizontal axis, we've got the number of firms. And we're trying to look at an equilibrium within a market about how much or the price that's going to be charged that firms are going to charge and their costs, etc. So what we've got here is a cost curve, or a supply curve if you like. I don't want to call it a supply curve, but so average costs, remember, rise as the number of firms rise. Okay, remember why each firm produces a smaller quantity themselves. So remember, this isn't Q on the horizontal axis. So as the number of firms increases and firms lose the ability to take advantage of economies of scale, their average costs are going to be higher. So that's an upward sloping curve. We've also got this what I've called here PP. As the number of firms increases, the price that each firm charges decreases because of increased competition. So this is the idea, of course, is that the more and more firms you get, the more this kind of market starts to approximate or get very much closer to perfect competition, in the sense that each firm has a very large number of very close substitutes as competitors. And so, of course, you're forced to lower your prices to try and compete when you've got more competition. Yeah. So that's downward sloping. As the number of firms increases, the price that each firm charges will decrease. So what we want to do, we want to look at equilibrium, of course, but we sort of want to prove equilibrium in this market by disequilibrium. So I've just got this point here, which I've called N1 firms. So there's a small number of firms. Now, with a small number of firms, the price is very much greater than the average costs. Yeah. So in other words, because the prices that you can charge are higher, because you don't have as much competition, and the costs are lower, therefore you're going to make economic profits. Now remember, when economic profits are made, that's very attractive to people and to organisations outside of this market, and so firms enter. And so there is an increase, you can see here, in the number of firms. Pick another point to the right of this, where you've got, say, a large number of firms now, N2. Now, of course, remember, with that large number of firms, firms can't reach economies of scale, or as much economies of scale, so their costs are going to be higher. But with that huge amount of competition, the prices are lower. So we've got average cost greater than price. So if you want to think about it in those terms, losses are made. And so when losses are made, some firms are going to leave. And so again, you get this thing where the number of firms will start to decrease. Now, of course, as many of you probably would guess by now, that point there is our equilibrium, because what that is showing is there's prices equal to average cost. That's zero economic profits. And we have in equilibrium sort of this number of firms, okay? Normal profits are being made. Firms neither have the incentive to enter nor to leave this particular market. And so this is how we sort of look at, we're going to incorporate this into or use this with our model of international trade, recognising this. We've got to recognise the sort of the internal machinations of monopolistic competition first. And this, even though it's a model that's quite different to what we're used to, because here it's talking about the number of firms and not the quantity of industry output or firm output, it's a useful one for us to have, because we can look at this and then we can sort of extrapolate from here.